Tom Swarbrick. Tweet at LBC.
As attention focuses on the tabloid press, I want to talk about the future of the BBC for a little moment, because they are now in Downing Street's crosshairs. They, according to the Sunday Times, have really turned on Auntie, vowing to scrap the television licence fee and make viewers pay a subscription. The national broadcaster could also be compelled to downsize and sell off most of its radio stations. The Sunday Times says that in a plan that would change the face of British broadcasting, senior aides to the Prime Minister insisted that they are, quotes, not bluffing about changing the BBC's funding model and pruning its reach into people's homes. The suggestion that is being drawn up in government at the moment looks like there's going to be an attempt to scrap the licence fee and replace it with a subscription model, force the BBC to sell off the vast majority of its 61 radio stations but safeguard Radio 3 and Radio 4, reduce the number of the corporation's national television channels from its current 10, scale back the BBC website, invest more in the World Service, and interestingly, ban BBC stars from cashing in with lucrative second jobs. Ministers are already consulting on plans to decriminalise non-payment of the licence fee from 2022 and have suggested the compulsory levy should be scrapped by 2027, or could be scrapped by 2027, when the BBC's charter is set for renewal. Have a listen to what a senior source told the newspaper. "We are not bluffing on the licence fee. We are having a consultation and we will whack it." I'll just make an interjection there. If you're having a consultation and saying we will whack it in the same breath, then judicial review, prepare for. Because you can't have a consultation knowing what, or saying what the outcome is going to be. Obviously, I think it's fair to say governments have consultations with the hope of having a particular response. But if you're going out and you're saying, we'll have a consultation, we don't care about the response, we're going to whack it anyway. The quote goes on, it has to be a subscription model. They've got hundreds of radio stations. They've got all these TV stations and a massive website. The whole thing needs massive pruning back. They should have a few TV stations, a couple of radio stations, a massively curtailed online presence, and put more money and effort into the World Service, which is part of its core job. There has been, as a result of these briefings, and sometimes as a result of the people who've been put into positions of power, one being John Whittingdale, the former Culture Secretary, who's reappointed as a Minister of State in his old department on Friday, who has been a long-standing critic of the BBC licence fee. There's been a bit of backlash on the Tory backbenches. Certain members of the Conservative Party MPs saying, up with this, we don't like the way that sources in Number 10 are attacking the BBC. In fact, some go as far as to say it's cultural vandalism. A little earlier tonight, I spoke to Roger Mosey, the former editorial director of the BBC, and Mark, who is from the Licence Fee Resistance Campaign. I started off by asking Mark that very point, if the move to scrap the licence fee entirely would be, as the former Deputy Prime Minister Damien Green says, an act of cultural vandalism.
I think it could well be that, but it's also inevitable development, given where we are, and given the recent history of the media as well.
And inevitable because what, the BBC has overreached itself, it's too stretched and it's now landing on commercial territory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're in a situation where the BBC runs more commercial TV channels than publicly funded TV channels. And okay, they're perhaps of a different size and scale, but nevertheless, it kind of gives an indication of the direction in which they're heading. And I don't think you can have that. I think they lose perspective on their public service remit when they're engaged in a lot of other commercial activity.
Is that a fair criticism, Roger Mosey? Do you think the BBC has gone too far in challenging commercial rivals?
No, and the BBC is facing declining audiences, actually. Its audiences are not going up. I do think there is a debate to be had about the future of the BBC and about the size and shape of it. What I don't think is a late-night ramblings from Downing Street sources are the way to do it. And you need a proper national debate in which the licence payers take part rather than politicians who might be bearing a grudge.
Mark, I wonder whether you think that the BBC offers value for money.
I think for those people that use it and make good use of it, I think it probably does. I think there's a whole generation of people out there who would rather pay half the amount of the TV licence and subscribe to Netflix or Amazon And there's another demographic out there that subscribes to Now TV and the other pay TV services as well, which may be more expensive than the licence fee, but they obviously get value for money from that. So I think there's a bigger, broader, more flexible media market out there, and I think that within that, the BBC starts to look quite monolithic and a little bit old-fashioned.
The thing is, you've got the problem is though, Mark. There's clearly a huge scale between the BBC completely shutting down and the BBC continuing as is, and you've got Downing Street sources saying, quotes, they should have a few TV stations, a couple of radio stations, a massively curtailed online presence, and put more money and effort into the World Service, which is part of its core job. A lot of this sounds a bit vitriolic, doesn't it?
It does, but also I think you need to bear in mind the art of the possible as well. And the government are constrained by the existing charter agreement, which limits what they can do at the charter review point in 2022. They can't simply shut the BBC down in total. That's not going to be viable politically or in terms of the charter agreement. So I think what they're looking at is what can we do in terms of both trimming the excesses as they see them, but also preparing the BBC for the future as well. And I think that they will take the BBC further towards the subscription direction, building on what was done in 2016 with the iPlayer change. I think they will build upon that, and we'll start to see the BBC's licence looking more like a subscription. Well, that will have in turn effects on what the BBC can do. Let me come to this one idea, Roger, which I can't help but wonder we'll see a lot of approval from members of the public, is this idea of banning BBC stars from cashing in with lucrative second jobs. So if you've made your name via a BBC programme, presumably the idea would be you can't then go around the conference circuit earning many multiples of thousands of pounds because you happen to have been on a publicly funded broadcaster. Would that be fair? Would that even be workable?
Well, I'm not sure it's workable, and the reason is that some people, quite a lot of people, the high-profile people in the BBC are usually freelancers, and some of them may only do one series a year, and you can't say to someone you cannot earn money for 46 weeks of the year just because you do something for 6 weeks a year. I think it's a rather different mass of members of BBC staff. But I think the trouble is that every time anybody comes up with any alternative ideas about the BBC, you see that the licence fee is often the least worst. And it's all very easy to get into this world of subscription. But actually, you know what? You probably can't do it with Freeview. You can't do it with radio stations. And it's very hard. I thought Damien Green had a really good point today when he said the government wasn't elected to abolish Radio 2. And that seems to me the problem about all of this stuff coming out of Downing Street at the moment. It's not practicable.
What do you think the BBC can do, as Mark says, then, to sort of future-proof itself, if it is going to maybe move to a subscription-style model?
Well, it should make the iPlayer the centre of what it does on video. And there is a possibility to add things at a subscription level on the iPlayer. So the BBC must change. And I think the BBC must change both in the way it structures itself, and also it has not been very good in recent years at representing the whole of the country. And I think that it needs more decision makers based outside London. It needs to be less metropolitan, less chattering class. There's a whole load of things a new DG needs to do, but I think it should be for the BBC to do that, in consort, of course, with the government, within a framework, but not just by the fiat of some advisor in Downing Street.
Do you think, Mark, that the essence of the BBC, what people love about the BBC, will be lost in a subscription model? I noticed that some of the quotes coming out of senior figures from the BBC suggested that, Gavin and Stacey at Christmas or the Strictly Come Dancing final wouldn't have the same power that they have in uniting the nation if they were subscription only for those who could afford it.
I think it's difficult to tell, and also it depends on the structure. And I think one of the issues with the debate that's going on at the moment is that we don't know what the proposed new structure for the BBC could be. So one of the possibilities, again based on what's possible at 2022, is that the BBC, the public service BBC, is scaled back with a corresponding reduction in the licence fee, but at the same time a major subscription-based BBC service is launched, and then the BBC gets to choose how it structures the publication of content on those two platforms. So perhaps you've got a situation where it does still commission premium content, possibly with partners around the world, which is what it's doing more and more. But those programs also appear on the public service side 3 months later, or some kind of arrangement like that. So it could actually end up being more flexible and also kind of more appropriate to the future as well.
It does seem, though, Roger, that whatever happens, the BBC is going to have to change quite fundamentally, given what's coming out of Downing Street and the government more generally. I wonder what advice you would give to your former colleagues at the BBC about how they put forward their own point of view, because at the moment, a lot of it feels a bit like, well, it's the BBC or some sort of absolute disaster Fox News style media landscape, which is not arguably not a brilliant attitude to have.
Yes, the worst thing for the BBC to do now would be to batten down the hatches, say it's not going to change, and just sit there saying we are perfect and we are absolutely wonderful, and that's not right. But for the government point of view, and it's interesting hearing the suggestion that you put some premium stuff out 3 months later. Well, you can't put out the Olympic opening ceremony 3 months later, and if you think how that brought us all together in 2012. It would really diminish the impact of Gavin and Stacey if it wasn't shown on Christmas night with immediate catch-up. So you risk losing a lot if you have the government battering ram, but the BBC really does need to wake up and smell the coffee about the way its audience behaviour is changing, and political expectations in all parties are changing too.
That was Roger Mosey, former editorial director of the BBC, and Mark II from the Licence Fee Resistance campaign that was speaking to me a little earlier on tonight. This backlash against what these Downing Street sources have been saying is growing. In fact, the Daily Telegraph front page tomorrow. The Conservative Party risks losing voters if it continues its vendetta against the BBC, senior Tories have warned. Backbench MPs threaten to oppose any plans by the government to scrap the licence fee and replace it with a subscription model. Hugh Merriman, who is the chairman of a parliamentary group on the BBC, has warned that picking such a potentially unpopular fight is unlikely to end well. Is that your view, that this is too far? Look, I think the BBC is going to have to reform, no doubt. The idea of criminalising non-payment of the licence fee is going to look ridiculous in a few years' time. That's going to have to be decriminalised. How that's then enforced by the BBC is a tough one for them, because plenty of people will, I'm afraid, just ignore it. So how you go about doing that, I don't know. But this goes too far for me, this stuff from number 10. Scrap the licence fee totally, go straight to a subscription model, sell off all the vast majority. It feels like there's a vendetta there. It feels unnecessary. And I wonder whether, Paul says here on 84850 that we should be worried. When people talk about BBC dwindling viewers, are they talking about live TV watching only? They never talk about the streaming audience, which continues to be growing. The BBC does need to change, but I worry at this latest intervention from Downing Street, especially as not long ago, they tried to bar journalists attending a government briefing. We should be worried, says Paul. 0345 6060 973. Is this going to be an unpopular move that not only is unlikely to end well, it actually might cost the Conservative Party in government votes? Tom Swarbrick on LBC. It's 11:48.